Okay, great. So let's start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marcela Morales. I am associate with OTT Consulting, and I will be moderating today's discussion on evidence-informed policymaking. The research we are exploring today stems from a collaboration with the University of Bristol. It has been made possible with the support of the Hewlett Foundation. Our discussion today will delve into insights generated by researchers Jessica Espe from Ediada Catherine at the University of Bristol, Ivor Tipke from the Health Institute, Anton Cartwright from the African Center for Cities, Fred Toto from ASET in Benin, and Aisha Ali and Ashan Ramlat from Samahi Research. So this panel, we want to provide insights, what it draws from recent history, theory, and key studies in Africa to illuminate best practices and considerations for enhancing evidence engagement within the UN General Assembly. So joining us today are our panelists, Jessica Espe, the principal investigator of this research project, Frejus Toto, executive director of ASET in Benin, Anton Cartwright from the African Center for Cities, Achan Ramlat from Samahi Research in South Sudan. So welcome everyone to this panel. It's great having you here. Before we start, I just wanted to kindly ask you to keep your mics off during the interventions so we can hear you better. So before we jump in, I just want to welcome first Jessica Espe, our principal investigator. Jess, could you briefly share with us the underlying purposes of this research and the key highlights that emerged from your analysis? Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thanks to Marcella and On Think Tanks for convening this virtual event. And sorry that we can't be with you live in person in Uganda. We hope it's a productive conference. My name's Jessica Espe. I'm an academic at the University of Bristol in the UK. Prior to being at Bristol University, I actually worked in and with the United Nations for a long time. And drawing on that experience, my research is focused on international governance of sustainable development, and specifically around the use of evidence, broadly defined, and more specifically scientific evidence, say in inverted commas, and how we use that kind of analytical information in decision-making processes worldwide. In particular, I've been working a lot on the role of the UN General Assembly. The UN General Assembly, I think, is particularly interesting because it is kind of the senior most policy forum in the world. And it is the sort of mechanism we've used since 1945 to deliberate on kind of many of the most pressing international challenges. And in the face of the sustainable development challenges we face today, climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemics, and so on, its role is becoming more and more important. But against that backdrop, it's a very old institution. It's still in the same sort of, has the same modes of operating as it had since 1945. And there are all kinds of practical and political challenges associated with that. And so this really brings me on to the focus of this research today, which is that a year ago, a new president of the UN General Assembly was appointed, a diplomat called Csaba Kőrösi, who was the former Hungarian ambassador to the United Nations and had chaired the negotiations on the future set of sustainable development goals, the SDGs, which were a set of targets agreed in 2015. Ambassador Kőrösi is very committed to the greater use of scientific evidence, in particular in political processes, and was very instrumental in trying to change the way practices were done in negotiating the SDGs. And so with that background, he came to the new presidency of the General Assembly saying, well, what can we do to make this international institution more fit for purpose and more agile and able to understand and respond to many of the challenges that we're facing in the 21st century related to sustainable development. So a big priority for him was trying to think about how we could use more forms and more diverse forms of evidence to inform political deliberation in the General Assembly. And so it's with that this wonderful group of academics came together, and I've had the pleasure of working with colleagues from South Africa, working on case studies in South Africa and Tanzania, from Benin, and also from colleagues who've been working on South Sudan. And what we've been trying to do is broaden the current literature or academic evidence on the question of how do you use evidence to inform political processes. And there's quite a lot of academic sort of study of this topic out there, and there has been really since the 1990s, when the focus of how you use evidence in policymaking or evidence-informed policymaking really kind of exploded in the policy sciences and political sciences academic world. But there's quite a paucity of information from a number of particularly global south countries, sort of better understanding what are the mechanisms that are used to convey information, what kinds of evidence counts, whose evidence counts, what makes it robust, what makes it legitimate, and lots of questions like that. And so what we wanted to try and do with this project was to try and tease out some insights from lots of different interesting national evidence to policy processes to help inform some of the questions that we might ask in that broader international debate about evidence in the UN, and specifically in the UN General Assembly. So we're working across quite a few levels here. We're looking at national policy processes, how they work, what kinds of inputs feed into these different processes. And specifically, we were interested in drawing on evidence from sub-Saharan Africa, which we felt was quite unstudied in a lot of the existing literature. And then once we teased out that evidence, we were looking at these sort of stories of policy influencing. We then wanted to see whether any of those insights could be extrapolated to support thinking about this question at the international level. So that's really what we've been aiming to do with this project. I would love to share some insights on kind of some of the common findings from the work that colleagues have been doing, but I think I'm going to pause at this point, and it would probably be better for me to stop talking, hear from the people who've actually been doing the really interesting country case studies, and then maybe we can come back to what we've observed in the central sort of research team, what we've observed are some of the common insights across the 4 very diverse case studies that we've done as we've collectively have pursued as part of this work. So I'll leave it there, but thank you so much, Marcella, for the chance to do that quick introduction, and look forward to hearing from colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jess. We will get back to the research, and we'll have more space to discuss the findings in more detail. So next, I would like to introduce Frejus Soto, Executive Director of ASED in Benin. Frejus and his team has worked in the realm of evidence-based policymaking in food security and nutrition policies within Benin. So welcome, Frejus. Could you walk us through your research and the key findings you've discovered in your analysis?
Thank you very much, Marcella, and good morning or good afternoon. I don't know when this will be played, but I'm very glad to join the Evidence 2023 conference, both virtually through this panel discussion, but also physically in Entebbe, Uganda. This has become a very good opportunity for us to gather at the continental level so that we can continue exchanging practices, ideas, and lessons on evidence-informed policymaking. So as Marcella has mentioned, my name is Frejus Toto. I'm the Executive Director of the African Center for Equitable Development. We are a think and do tank driving equitable development across Africa with a particular focus on Francophone nations. And we do that by building partnerships, sharing expertise, and developing sustainable solutions, collaborating with policymakers and practitioners. Our work is focused on 4 thematic areas: human development, digital economy, nature economy, and the food system. And it's in that last cluster, the food system cluster, that we collaborated with on think tank and the University of Bristol to put together this case study, which informs a kind of a global reflection on how evidence can be used in decision making, especially in international bodies such as the General Assembly. Our case study was a very particular one. It focused both on a geographical region, so it was focused on Benin, but also on a thematic coverage on the agricultural sector. So we explored the complex dynamics of evidence-informed policy processes within the agricultural, food security, and nutrition ecosystem in Benin. Um, the scope of the study was basically to do a kind of analysis of the country's context, including its political landscape, the socio-economic development, the role of the agricultural and sector, and how key institutions and actors are involved in managing the agricultural, food security, and nutrition policy, what kind of evidence is used, how that evidence is translated into policy and practice, and ultimately how institutionalization can be something that becomes a reality in the country. In terms of key findings from the case study, we really noticed that there were diverse types of evidence that were used in the ecosystem. There was not just one type of evidence, such as scientific evidence coming in the format of scientific papers, but we also have data that people relate, take as research. We also have evaluation findings. And most importantly, one thing that is very clear also in the ecosystem is that policymakers also value what they call the expert knowledge, which could be individuals from their own network or people that they think they hold a kind of knowledge that could inform the policymaking process. But there are still challenges, especially in terms of the quality of that evidence and how localized and relevant it is for the policymaking process. We also found that policymakers, they tend to favor practical and socially based evidence, while academic evidence often remains kind of disconnected from the interest and concerns. This is materialized by the fact that you would see very good research that is done in the academic field, but which may not find its way through the policy making process. Regarding the evidence production and utilization, practicability and accessibility are very key in terms of the potential for evidence use. And currently in the ecosystem, those two aspects, the practicability and accessibility, are kind of misaligned with the policymakers' needs. Practicality refers basically to the operational value of the decision for the decision maker of the evidence that is being presented with, providing actionable guidance and context-specific information. And regarding accessibility, we are basically talking about the availability of the evidence in a format that could be something that is useful for the decision maker. So far, especially the scientific evidence is made basically put in terms of academic outputs. It could be scientific paper or long research papers, which are not very much accessible to the different policy makers. Particularly in the case of Benin, in terms of communication of scientific evidence, we also realize that the language is a kind of barrier, because although we are in a purely francophone country, we notice that most of the scientific evidence is produced in English to help researchers to have a good exposure in the scientific scientific community. But the negative side of that is that the research that is produced is definitely out of scope for the policymakers who are in majority French speaking. In addition to that, there is also the problem of um, the researchers lacking the ability to produce more policy relevant content, which is coming from the fact that the research agendas are not definitely developed in conjunction with the users who could be the policy makers. We also found another important aspect, which is the role of the intermediaries. We found some organizations in the ecosystem which act neither as a producer nor as a direct users, but more as knowledge brokers, as intermediaries. There are, for example, some civil society organizations that are in direct contact with the policymakers that use researchers from the academia or from other evidence producer circle to support maybe some of the advocacy campaign. There are also, but very few, brokering organizations, dedicated organizations that work on, between the producers and the users of the evidence. So those are some of the key elements that were found. In terms of institutionalization, there is a dynamic in place, but we still have a lot to do to have evidence use very well institutionalized in the agricultural and food security sector. At the institutional architecture level, there are formal incentives for policymakers to use evidence, but those incentives are not yet very well, put in place so that the policymaker will have easy access to evidence and will, in a way or not, been able to use evidence, which comes to the fact that there will be a need to look beyond the formal evidence architecture and find other stakeholders like civil society organizations, development partners, who can also be good knowledge brokers for supporting evidence use because of the power in the ecosystem. And I will end on that aspect of power dynamics, because sometimes when we look at the evidence-informed policy making in our different contexts, we tend to not look at the power dynamics. And one aspect of that power dynamics is the role of the development partners in pushing for or not the use of evidence. We don't take them as direct stakeholder in the evidence-informed policy making, but the way that they kind of control the finance, the funding for different organizations, they also come with a lot of power, and their requirement could be good incentives for policymakers. In the case of the agricultural sector in Benin, it's very clear that different development partners could play a key role in pushing for the use of evidence in the national ecosystem. The final aspect of our research, we could not be very much elaborated, was the impact that evidence could have on the different, on a very particular development sector. It's not easy to link up the evidence work to tangible impact, but in the case study, we use the process approach to find how evidence has been able to inform different development programs that could lead to a kind of tangible outcomes in the field. So yeah, that's what we want to share just in a nutshell in our research for that analyzes the use of evidence in the agricultural sector in Benin. we really hope that this could be
Thank you very much,
something.
Frederick. That was very.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like to now introduce Ashan Ramlat from Samahi Research. She has been working with Aisha Ali on their study that explores evidence-informed policymaking within the context of the national budget process. So, Ashan, welcome to this panel. Could you share with us the highlights and key findings from your research? Ashan, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. These are the challenges we face with technology. Thank you once again inviting us for this to this panel and sharing our findings. My name is Achan Ramnat, as Marcel has introduced, and my colleague Aisha is not here. Our findings focused on our role that we play in the public financial management sector in South Sudan, and it's focusing specifically on the national budget process through a survey that we participate in biannually called the Open Budget Survey. The Open Budget Survey is a global survey that is conducted by the International Budget Partnership that is based in Washington alongside researchers from over 115 countries globally. And so the focus is on looking at the different national budget processes, whether it's transparent, whether the information is available, whether it's citizens, the public is allowed to participate, and genuinely, not just for the cosmetic aspects of it. Um, but before going that, I think we have to understand the context of South Sudan to understand why this case study specifically was important for the study. The context of South Sudan is that South Sudan is coming from it's in a post-conflict kind of environment right now, and it's in the process of putting structures, the necessary structures in place. Of course, the recent wars and the wars before that have heavily impacted on the institutions of the country. And so there's a lot of money that is being put towards the institutionalization process, and especially the managing of finances, so that the budget speaks for everyone. It meets everyone's needs as opposed to the few. So in that case, the PFM is a very critical aspect of our study, but also generally for South Sudan, because the funding is very important. It goes to the needs that speaks to the needs of the people. So in that regard, the open budget survey and within our findings, what when we did the findings, what pointed to was that first of all, when you look at the open budget survey, the evidence types that we look at the pre-budget statements. So you look at the budget cycle, for instance, and the budget cycle, you have the formulation, and then the implementation, then you have the approval, then you have the implementation, then you have the execution stage. And so that is how the open budget survey goes, and it follows the budget cycle essentially. And so in the pre-approval stage, we look at the pre-budget statement, which essentially talks about what the government's priorities are, the plans are, and then it is taken to the draft budget, which is taken to the parliament, and uh, and uh, and then eventually, when the budget is passed, then it becomes a budget, a national budget. And so, in terms of evidence types, what is often looked at is what data is important to the policymakers. For instance, what do they use? And in this case, usually the reports. Once before the drafting, or even after the implementation of the report of the budget, it's the reports that shows how the government has performed vis-a-vis what has been planned. And what our findings show over time is that when it came to the particular documents that are uploaded in the government in the Ministry of Finance website, which basically the open budget survey looks at the availability of documents on the Ministry of Finance website. That is their measure, because it's free and it's accessible. That's the whole thing, and it should be timely so that people are able to engage before the process. So if it is, for instance, the budget proposal, they expect it at least a month or so to be uploaded on the budget on the Ministry of Finance website so that people are able to access it. If it is the enacted budget, they expect it within a few weeks to be uploaded. If it is the pre-budget statement, they expect it to be uploaded before. So the point is to engage, to have the public engage once it's put in the platform. And also the audit reports eventually once the implementation is done and how the execution is done, it's uploaded. However, of course, there are challenges. There are challenges because budget is political. It is, in as much as it is, it touches everyone, but it's also a political process and it has political interests. So there will be reasons why, like as to why sometimes some documents are uploaded and some documents are not uploaded, or there is an inconsistency in uploading some of the documents. For instance, sometimes you will find the pre-budget statement is not uploaded, and of course, then you have to reach out to the different government entities, specifically in the Ministry of Finance, and ask why it has not been uploaded. And I mean, they're not clear reasons, essentially, why it is not uploaded. When you also go to, sometimes the draft budget is not uploaded, sometimes it's uploaded. So there are inconsistencies and there are reasons, but it points to a more broader political. I don't. It's more a subtle kind of power play that is beyond the role of the civil society. So you're able to. So the most you can do is probably attend the sessions in some cases in the parliament and get the information that sometimes is needed, but sometimes some key information is omitted from the budget. So so essentially, you will get some documents you don't want to get. So since the time we have started using the Open Budget Survey, which was in 2017, and then we also participated in 2019 and 2021, the country has performed progressively well. From that, we started with we had only five, and that is looking at the transparency scores. We had only five because the documents were by and large not being uploaded on the Ministry of Finance website. But then once we pushed for it, and that's the element now of the role of civil society and other actors in this process. Because once you have different actors and different interests, they push, they advocate, and they want something for the benefit of the public. So we pushed, and we the citizens budget was produced. So the citizens budget is just a simpler version of the national budget, but it's communicated to any citizen can understand, because it will tell you this, the budget speaks to this, the budget speaks to this, and this is how it impacts on you. And sometimes ordinarily, I mean, I didn't have interest in the budget per se, even me as an individual, till I got engaged in this open budget survey, because sometimes you feel it is far away, it is for the policy makers, it is for the government officials, it is for the parliamentarians, it's none of my business. But then when you explain to someone that what the government decides there has an impact on your food, has an impact on your health access, has an impact on your well-being, general well-being, it changes the way we look at things and the way we perceive things and the way we want to push and advocate so that it is able to reach out to so many people. So when we started doing the advocacy, and we pushed, and we produced the citizens budget, which was the first of its kind in 20, I think it was 2018. We produced that. So the next time we had, and then we engaged with the citizens, different parliamentarians. In the 2019, our score went to, I think, 7, and it was just because of the whatever that we produced, the citizens budget that we produced. But the point is that we look beyond the scores. The scores are just it's kind of like an incentive, but the bigger picture is that the message is being delivered. The information, the public is getting more knowledge about what is happening in the national budget process, and they're getting more involved in the process. So in that case, the space is getting more opened. And then also more evidence types is being further disaggregated, so that the common person is able to understand what is happening in the political space, in the policy space, and all that. So in the last round, which was in 2021, we scored 15, I think, and that was because additional documents in the budget process was being produced. Um, in terms of the, I think it's impact. Yeah, in terms of the impact, we cannot say that we've had a direct impact because there's so much that is happening in the scene in the country right now. There are so many government international efforts that is being done to improve on the PFM sector. And so there's a lot of money that is being put there by different donors to work towards that. So we kind of like benefit from the momentum that is there right now, but it's also easily accepted because then people understand why PFM, why the government should be accountable, why they should be responsible, and what the budget process means to them. As a takeaway, I think it's important that the role of civil society and other actors is appreciated in the policy making process of evidence generation policy making process because they provide an insight that someone who is not on ground will never understand. They understand the nuances, they understand the subtle messages that are communicated, and they're easily accepted by by the government, the policymakers, but also the other stakeholders who are involved in the process. So I think it's important that the people are involved in a more productive and constructive way that brings we'll be able to get a better outcome to everyone. So I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Ashan. So now we have Anton Cartwright from the African Center for Cities. Anton research was focused on the Tanzanian Urbanization Laboratory's endeavor to reshape development assistance role in supporting national urban policy in Tanzania. So Anton, welcome. Could you please walk us through your research?
Thank you very much, Marcella. As mentioned, this particular case study focused on the role of evidence and how that does or doesn't inform the process of policy reform. The particular context in which we tried to look at that was Tanzania in the period 2017 to 2020. But Tanzania in the context of trying to make local sense of some powerful and traveling global themes. Those themes were climate change itself, particularly the work on climate change that was beginning to focus on the contribution of cities to the global effort on climate change, both to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also to build climate resilience. And so that whole strand of thinking and work and policy advocacy that came largely out of the UN, but was also linked to organizations such as C40 and ICLE. And together with that, the work done by UN Habitat at their 2016 conference, which really focused on the role of multi-level governance and the need for countries to have what were called national urban policies, again, to make sense of international themes and national policies at the very local scale. The importance of this for Tanzania was that at that time, and true to this day still, Tanzania was a rapidly urbanizing country. So roughly 5.5% expansion of the urban population every year. It was a country that had set itself the goal of transitioning from low income to middle income between the periods of 2017 to 2023. So it was also looking to industrialize. And it had in place some really, at least in theory, some very sort of good urban policy in terms of master planning and in terms of a policy called decentralization by devolution. So at least the superficial level, Tanzania had all the components with which to engage these international ideas and to draw them down and indeed to benefit from them. But the reality in Tanzania at that time was that actually under the president at the time, that administration, they were busy with quite a profound process of centralization of power, particularly fiscal centralization, and that they were mobilizing a strong pushback on the global climate narrative to enable them to benefit from new finds of natural gas and oil to the south of the country. And so the general message coming out of the presidency at the time was that climate change was not Tanzania's problem, and that it was a problem created by other people. And it was certainly blind to the opportunities that might be garnered through a proactive response. Why that context matters is that, and I should locate myself in this research at this moment, is that at the African Centre for Cities, we were asked by international donors to then go and develop a national urban policy together with Tanzanian officials to draw down these Habitat 3 and climate change efforts to the context of Tanzania. But of course, given the disconnect between what Tanzania was actually doing and these international ideas, that was a very difficult task. And so we had to scratch our heads a little bit as to how to make sense of this demand, particularly as an academic institution. And what we did at the African Centre for Cities was default to a methodology that we've used before, which is a city lab methodology. And we established cautiously, after more or less a year of consultation, we established what became known as the Tanzanian Urbanization Laboratory. This was a group of government officials, academics, civil society people, and a few business people as well, but predominantly comprised of Tanzanians who came together and performed, actually, in the end, 5 pieces of research together, the type of evidence which might be needed really to make sense of the urbanization demographic trend in Tanzania, and possibly even to take advantage of it in the context of climate change. So the Tanzanian Urbanization Laboratory became a way to at least begin a conversation of how to make sense of these ideas which were kind of gaining traction at the international level, despite the fact that the local conditions were really not conducive to that sense-making at all. Okay. In fact, that the local conditions were quite confrontational, oppositional to the effort, and deep political anxiety around the urbanization trend and the political power that was perhaps incubating in Tanzanian cities at the time from within the central administration. In the end, as I said, we did 5 pieces of work, so 5 different strands of evidence gathering. And the important thing about that, and this is really sort of what I took from this exercise of being able to reflect on my time in Tanzania, were a few things really. First of all, is that the process of gathering data, contrary to what is sometimes suggested in the literature, actually does not necessarily build consensus. Very often what we did when we brought these pieces of research into the Tanzanian Urbanization Laboratory for peer review and for deliberation, is we actually surfaced deep differences including within government and within government departments as to what the data actually meant and how we should draw inference from this data and sort of so what as to how we should respond to this data, particularly around this issue of whether urbanization was an opportunity or additional kind of hazard or liability to be counted. So it wasn't at all clear to me that research always produces consensus. It can have the opposite effect. And then what do you do with that? The second thing that was very clear is that drawing on multiple strands of evidence, and both qualitative and quantitative evidence, actually made for much richer conversations. And in the end, I think we can say with some confidence, made for better policy formulation in the form of a national urban policy. But it was not instantaneous, right? And so the transition from evidence to peer review to policy formulation certainly wasn't linear and certainly wasn't instantaneous. In fact, when our project ended in 2020, there was still not a national urban policy in place in Tanzania. But what there was a whole bunch of evidence which was produced by locals, held by locals, peer-reviewed by locals, and I like to think that local policymakers, local civil society, local academics were quite vested in the conversations which we had incubated in the Tanzanian Urbanization Laboratory. And what that meant is that when the administration changed in 2021, following President Magufuli's passing, and a new administration came in, there was a fertile territory under which the new administration could go looking for new ideas on how to cope with the urbanization megatrend. And part of that was really just people who were actually quite upbeat about the opportunity that urbanization presented, rather than what had prevailed before our involvement and before our evidence gathering, which was really that urbanization was going to compound risks and and amplify the development challenge, and is something that should be resisted at all costs. And happily, I think now with the benefit of some hindsight, but not immediate, it wasn't immediately evident. I think the evidence that we gathered and deliberated and then became quite vested in the Tanzanian Urbanization Laboratory, which is, by the way, is an institution that has continued to do pieces of work after the donor funding ended, has been very useful to the process of eventually formulating better urban policies in Tanzania. And I'm not sure that would have been possible if we hadn't gone through that quite difficult, quite contested, at times quite confrontational, but I think ultimately very valuable process. Thanks. So I should add one more point, if I may. Sorry, I know we're up until time, but really, what I take from this is that so often we're quick to invest in the evidence generation, but we underestimate the importance of investing in the sort of evidentiary process, if you like, or the institutions that then generate the information and hold the information. Because again, this would be probably my ultimate takeout from the research, is that evidence is necessary but insufficient, and how we relate to that evidence, how we use that evidence, I think is as important, if not more important. But we tend not to invest in that. We tend to think that evidence on its own can drive the change that we want, and that certainly wasn't our experience in Tanzania.
Thank you very much to our panelists. I also want to welcome Ivor Chupking from the New South Institute. Our panelist brings a thought-provoking research paper shedding light on the dynamics between epistemic communities and policymaking in South Africa. So welcome, Ivor. Could you please tell us a bit more about your paper and the key findings of your research?
Thanks, Marcella. Thank you for the introduction, and it's very nice to be part of this panel and largely more broadly part of this important project. So the project has been quite an interesting provocation for me, and especially introduced me to new literatures. And I've been engaging conceptually with the notion of an epistemic community, and in relationship to the policymaking process. And I think the concept is challenging in a whole range of respects. First of all, it asks us to think a policy process is not just a kind of a formal process which obeys certain steps of policy formulation, analysis, etc. But thinking really around the kinds of people that come together to make policy, and the kinds of shared values, the kind of shared arguments that they make, and the kinds of assumptions they bring to the policy-making process, and how that plays out in informing what gets produced in that regard. So I found the concept very, very useful, and I'll come to it in thinking around policy-making in South Africa. Who are the people that come together to develop key policies in South Africa? What is the nature of those communities? How have those communities changed in respect to key areas? And how has that affected what gets done over various periods of time? So I've applied the notion of an epistemic community to understanding policymaking in respect of public sector reform in South Africa. It's the area that I do a lot of work on. Trying to understand the various phases and stages of policymaking with regard to public sector reform. And I found the concept very, very useful in this respect. What the literature asks us to think about in terms of an epistemic community is not just the personalities involved and the degree to which they share common values or norms, but also the degree to which they pose questions about causality. In other words, the degree to which they define the elements of the key elements, and then to understand the causality between those elements. So the policymaking really is an analytical exercise. And I found that very, very useful to thinking around what a genuine policymaking process is, one that engages with the questions of causality and analysis, as opposed to what I'm increasingly calling one that is mimetic, drawing on the work of Pritchett and Wilcock and others, a process that is largely based on what they called anthropomorphic mimicry, this idea of merely copying forms in the policy-making process, so that what we do in the policy process is that we copy good practices from elsewhere without seeing the degree to which they apply to our local contexts. So what I've done in the paper on public service reform is I've drawn it up into separate epochs or different periods. I've tried to periodize the policy-making process with regard to civil service reform. So I've defined an initial period around the transition after 1994, where something quite extraordinary happens, both by South African standards, but also by international standards, is that we end up with out of that process, we end up with a policy around public service reform, which informs practice largely, which emphasizes two key values. One is that the public service should be massively and heavily politicized. And we see that in the foundational piece of legislation of 1994, which is the Public Service Act. And in Section 3 of the Public Service Act, what you have in a very, very unusual formulations is that discretion for the recruitment of public servants and also for operational decisions in departments is given to the president and to relevant ministers. In other words, the kind of administrative decisions which are key to deciding the staffing of operational units and then the design of operational units, the kinds of areas which are normally handed over to professional public servants or officials are handed over to politicians in effect. So again, it's designed to give maximum political control over the administrations in the Public Service Act. The other area, and you see this in a legislation from a little later on, the Public Finance Management Act, is that maximum management discretion. So the idea being to improve efficiencies and effectiveness within the public service, we need to de-bureaucratize departments, move away from rules and regulations as framing the work of public servants, and rather let them become managers, so give them high levels of discretion. So you've got this weird situation emerging in South Africa between, on the one hand, maximum political control, which essentially disempowers managers, and on the other hand, moves to give them maximum control through these managerial interventions in the design of the public service. So I was trying to understand how this happens in the formative period. And what I've argued essentially is that in the early period and during the transition, an epistemological community comes into existence, but it's also one with mimetic features, what I've called a deontological community as well, the kind of opposite of an epistemological community. So, I've framed these differences. So essentially what you have is you have an analysis of the public service coming out of the African National Congress, which is trying to make causal arguments. The argument essentially is that they've inherited a public service which is staffed overwhelmingly by apartheid-era bureaucrats who they don't trust to implement their policies, and therefore they've designed a system to maximize political control over these apartheid-era officials. That's on the one hand, and I think that is, even if you don't agree with the analysis, it's nonetheless an analysis which is based on evidence, is based on a causal arguments around the relation between variables. And then the move to management. And the move to management is really the influence of the new public management in South Africa. It's largely borrowings of kind of Labour Party versions of Thatcherite new public management. So you have the strange amalgamation of what I've called an epistemological community on the one hand and a mimetic community on the other hand. So this is a kind of a hybrid policy-making community that emerges in the 1994. What is interesting, and this moves into the kind of the second phase, is that very quickly there's an analysis. This is problematic. This is not working for the South African circumstances, that it's producing fundamental contradictions and tensions within departments which are sabotaging the way in which they function administratively. You have, for example, very, very early on in the transition, 1998 Presidential Review Commission, which draws attention to some of these tensions between, on the one hand, high levels of management discretion, on the other hand, political control. But it never gets acted on. And what we have for a very long period of time, communities of analysis, which are describing these problems, but there's no movement on them. Until 2008, and this is really the second period, the Department of Public Service and Administration generates a quite profound analysis of the problem and a way forward. So I call that the second epistemological community. Those proposals are never implemented, though. What you have is a draft piece of legislation emerges called the Public Administration Management Bill. I think it's an excellent piece of legislation. It's very sophisticated, but what it offers to do is remove political control of the public administration, and it's heavily resisted at the time. We then go into a period of state capture, and state capture is made possible precisely because politicians have such high discretion over operational decisions and over appointment decisions within the public service. And I won't get into the detail of the state capture years. So you have, again, a kind of a failed epistemic community, one that produces a very good analysis, but that policy-making process doesn't produce the kind of reforms which we needed because it doesn't win political support. So the third moment is the one which I think we're currently entering, and this is where the paper ends on a fairly hopeful note, and where the revisions of the paper as opposed to the first draft, because since I wrote the first draft, there have been some really exciting movements. So in the original draft, I had noticed the movement towards a professionalization framework to address the problems of the public service. But I'd argue that it was a community that had emerged, which was not an epistemic community. It wasn't in a community addressing causes. It was a mimetic, also a mimetic community. And that it was producing proposals around policy reform in South Africa, which I think failed to grasp the major challenges the country was facing. But since I wrote that proposal, there have been some very interesting developments. First of all, the original group of people that were driving the reform process has not been isolated, but new players have come onto the scene, and in particular, the Public Service Commission has come onto the scene as the drivers of the reform process. And the Public Service Commission, in its mandated role as the agent of implementing agency for the reforms, has done something quite extraordinary. It has widened the policy-making community again. So it's brought people like myself into it, and Auditor General into it, and a whole range of parties to the policy-making process, which historically have been excluded at least over the last 10 years, if not longer. And suddenly, what you have is a policy-making community which is making arguments based on causal analysis, drawing in evidence. It's open to evidence again. It's open to analytical arguments again. And so what you have is a proposals around public service reform, which are again, I think, addressing some of the core causal problems again. And this is producing, I think, some quite extraordinary output. So, for example, there's a piece of legislation which has now gone to Parliament, an amendment of the Public Service Act, which I think would be revolutionary if it passes. I wrote a short piece suggesting that we even in a kind of a second republic moment, a little bit like the moment of the Trevelyan reforms in the UK in the late 19th century, or the Pendleton Act of 1883 in the US of the kind of the ending of the Tammany Hall politics. I think we're at a potentially important moment. What I think is most exciting, and this is really where I'll end, is that the political moment is suddenly auspicious for these reforms to gain momentum. So I think the policy-making process has produced a genuine epistemic community, shared values, a kind of a shared set of beliefs around reform, but also a proper analysis around causes and relationship between variables, producing, I think, some really, really high quality proposals of reform. And I think where I have a reason for optimism is that the political environment is suddenly slightly different to what it was earlier when reforms failed, in that for the first time in South Africa's history, performance in government has suddenly become an electoral issue. So the African National Congress, the current ruling party, for example, is losing political support based on its poor performance in government. And at the same time, opposition parties are mobilizing on the basis that they will be better in government than the African National Congress has been. So suddenly, for the first time, I think ever, certainly in the first time in 30 years in South Africa, there is a huge political interest in policy making that will improve the performance of government. So I think for the first time in a long time, the opportunity for these proposals to be implemented and to be passed legislatively is very, very high. So I think that currently South Africa is moving from a situation of, I think, where there's profound gloom in the country, at least in the area of public service reform. I think there's I'm optimistic that these reforms will pass, and I'm also secondly also optimistic that these reforms are profound and important ones. So again, so I'm quite excited. And I think what's been so useful is thinking around the policy-making process, and this concept of epistemic community, I think, has been a very valuable one.
Thank you for all our panelists for sharing your insights. So as we continue the dialogue, we have about 20 minutes, and I would like to go back to each one of your presentations and ask you a few questions if possible. I wish we had more time to explore every facet of your very interesting presentations, but given the time constraints, I would like to kindly ask you to summarize your responses within 2-3 minutes if possible. So I would like to start with Jess. Jess, so one of the very interesting points of this research at all was the use of national level experiences to inform international level practice. Can you elaborate a little bit more on why national level experience is important at the international level?
Thanks, Marcella, and thanks to colleagues for sharing their insights on their fascinating case studies work. Yeah, I think we felt that there's a tendency often to study or observe international policymaking and kind of multilateral processes as this discrete entity that's sort of distinct or unsimilar to other political processes and scales. But of course, you know, ultimately, these are meant to be democratic spaces which are reflective of the views of all of the membership. In the case of the General Assembly, it's 193 UNGA members. And so the processes that are being kind of encouraged and cultivated and used to reach consensus should reflect processes being used nationally as well. And so I think the point is that we didn't want to sort of just study other international decision-making bodies and then come up with a set of recommendations based on other existing international practice. We want to actually look at what countries were doing in their own context and what might be different to what the current practices that we use and observe, what might be some different questions that are being asked. I think it's also really important to recognize as well that, as I said before, the UN is sort of you know, as much as I am, and I'll say it openly, a strong believer in multilateralism, the UN is sort of slightly hamstrung by its history and past, and its institutional structures are the product of a particular period of time, which is, you know, essentially the European allies and the victors of Second World War crafting a certain type of institution based on Western legal models, jurisprudence models, parliamentary systems, etc. And so with that means that there has been kind of particular ways of working that have historically been quite dominated by Europe and the United States, particularly privileging certain types of information, particularly privileging certain types of kind of quantitative evidence and so on. And so I think one of the things that we want to do with this project is actually really do a very broad systematic review of all the national literature that's been produced worldwide, as well as we said before, supplementing it with understudied political processes, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa, to kind of say, are there questions and other experiences from other contexts that we haven't asked or that we haven't aired, and kind of raise these as things that deliberators in the UN really need to critically reflect on. So that was really the ambition. It was just slightly to challenge the existing status quo and raise some interesting questions that are evolving from additional national contexts. Now, of course, lots of the insights generated by these national case studies are not necessarily transferable or relevant to a multi-country deliberative forum, but a lot of them are. So I think one of the things, some of the things that we've observed across all the cases that are incredibly relevant to a discussion about General Assembly reform are to do with really understanding the meaningful political economy of a particular situation and dynamic, right? If as we've heard in the case of Tanzania, there was a very trying political context at the time that the TLAB was operating, and understanding that and focusing less on kind of the direct political influencing and engagement and more on kind of creating a fertile evidence culture and bringing together actors who could over time kind of create a stronger epistemic community around different sectors, so that the evidence was there when the political opportunity was ripe to use it, was incredibly effective. So likewise within the General Assembly, if you're going through a period of time, as per the war in Ukraine, where dynamics between, for example, you know, certain countries, Russia, Europe, and lots of different sort of macro political dynamics are going to compromise our ability to have or are going to influence many of the political discussions going on in other forums, such as the General Assembly, we need to be cognizant of that and aware that certain types of information and evidence are going to be listened to, other types are not. Certain dynamics, this is going to affect how, for example, the G77 negotiates with, you know, the Russian bloc or the European bloc. So I think understanding the political economy of a given moment and therefore how to work within it and how to present evidence and mobilize evidence actors is really important. I think another point that was raised by Frejus, which is really important, is recognizing the accessibility of the information that's being presented. You know, there is a bias towards English literature publications from within my research anyway. I've observed that, even though there are 5 recognized international languages of the UN that all publications should be released in, but it doesn't always happen. And so there is this bias towards English language and literature, and that's a problem, essentially, for everyone to have equitable access to information. I think another interesting thing we've seen from Tanzania, from Benin, from Sudan has been the importance of really inclusive deliberative spaces. So kind of creating forums and not necessarily overly scripting what's going to happen in those spaces, but inviting very diverse actors, inviting very diverse evidence producers, and not just those from the scientific community, so academic institutions necessarily, but also inviting in people who are, you know, curating or producing traditional knowledge, people who are working, you know, on citizen-generated information and so on, and recognizing all of their different values and roles and contributions, but being transparent about how that is being recognized. I think one of the things that is a real struggle at the moment in the UN, which some of the case studies have recognized, is that different types of information are useful for different purposes, and that's fine. We just need to be really transparent about what we're using for what. So if you want a large-scale longitudinal study produced by the University of Oxford in order to make a decision about something to do with climate change, fine, because you need X years of data. You need it from an institution that's been collecting that data for X number of years, and you need it for this particular policy question. And that means you won't necessarily use indigenous information from this particular rural community. I think it's fine to do that as long as political decision makers are transparent about the kinds of information they're using, when and for what purposes, and therefore what they're not using. And that's not really a conversation that is happening right now in the UN. So again, just lots of interesting examples from these national case studies of how that kind of dialogue has been managed and brokered, how different evidence inputs have been used. And I think there's lots of insights from that we can extrapolate from and observe and use in these conversations in the international space. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much, Marcel.
Thank you very much, Jess. Moving on to Frejus. So Frejus, your research underscores the role of civil society organizations and also consultancy firms as intermediaries in evidence-informed decision-making. Could you elaborate on how these intermediaries can bridge the gap between evidence producers and policymakers, and perhaps what specific challenges and opportunities does this intermediary role present in Benin?
Thank you very much, Marcela. Definitely that aspect of intermediaries, we often tend to call them those people that we undervalue their contribution to the EIP ecosystem. But let me just give you an example in the case of our EIP activities here in Benin. We have one civil society organization, which is the APES organization of all farmers in Benin. They have a very strong positioning at the Ministry of Agriculture. No single, important decision could be made by could not be made by the ministry without their involvement. And this is something that they won after years of collaboration with the Ministry of Agriculture. But we come to the realization that even when they are defending or they are advocating for a particular situation or case for farmers, they don't have the relevant evidence to work with. So they will go with what we could call the moral case or what should be done, but it's not supported by evidence that could strengthen their positioning. So what we are trying now to do in the country is to use their positioning as a pivotal one, where we collaborate with that particular farmer organization and not directly with the Ministry of Agriculture. So in some way, we managed to put evidence into um, the policy making process without necessarily involving or discussing with the policymakers themselves, because that organization, they already have the space, they already have the proximity, and they already have the trust from the policymaker. So what we are now doing is to fuel the collaboration with the ministry with good evidence to support the different campaigns. Same thing with the consultancy firms. When the ministry or policymakers in our region, they want to learn more about the particular aspect, they generally issue call for proposals or bids where consultancy firms would come in and conduct some studies for policymakers. And those studies are often used as basis for decision making. So we are also trying to work with those consultancy firms so that they can have access to evidence of good quality, so that the products that they have in the end to be used by the policymakers, it will have a good value for the system. In terms of challenges, what do those intermediaries they face is, again, the same issue of accessibility. Some consultancy firm, they told us, for example, that they can't access databases of scientific papers because they are behind paywalls. So they are doing their work, their consultancy work, but based on what is that kind of evidence, they are not able to do good literature review. So the issue of accessibility is still there. When it is accessible, the issue of language or format is again a big challenge. So in relation to that, one thing that is very important that the kind organizations like ASET should focus on, and we are currently doing, is the work on the knowledge translation. So we make sure that the evidence that is out there is very well packaged in format that those intermediaries they can access. It can be in the format of just very concise briefs that we put together for them. It can also be in terms of dialogues that we organize with them to brief them on different aspects of the research that is being made. It can also be in terms of very specific evidence synthesis that we do for them when they are on very particular assignment. So intermediaries, in conclusion, they are very important. Sometimes they can shorten the way for knowledge brokering organizations or even evidence producers to be able to put the evidence on the table of the discussion with policymakers. Yeah. I would stop there, Marcel.
Thank you, Freitas. So I just wanted to also move on to Ashan and Anton. So Ashan, I wanted to ask you about transparency and openness, which you mentioned are essential for evidence-informed policymaking. So I was wondering, how has the transparency of budget review processes in South Sudan contributed to building public trust and engagement? Are there mechanisms in place to ensure that evidence is accessible and understandable to a wider audience, including the general public?
Thank you, Marcella. Yes, I mean, the different efforts that have been done by the different actors in this space has kind of created a platform to build on the transparency and on the openness of the national budget process. Today, as it is now, citizens' budget is being produced, so people have access to a more simplified version of the national budget. We intend to make it more simpler so the person in the market is able to understand that the tomatoes translates to this, or the fertilizer translates to this. This is in the pipeline. But the essence of evidence should be should be put in use by the end users. And who are the end users in this case, in the case of the budget process? So in terms of transparency, when you look at, say, the citizens budget being produced, that is one element of transparency. The fact that also that the documents are being uploaded on the Ministry of Finance website, even if it is inconsistent, the mere fact that it's being done is a step in the right direction. We need to understand that we don't work in a vacuum. We work in a political space, and every space has its own gatekeeper. In this case, we have the Ministry of Finance as the gatekeeper, and it has its own interests and its own views as to why it will upload certain documents and it won't upload certain documents. But this is a work, something that we are working on, and it will take time to get there. But I think these incremental gains should not be lost because we're aiming for something much bigger. In terms of openness, today you get communication from the ministry, that the chairperson, the finance committee, the specialized finance committee from the parliament, when they're going to have proceedings, budget proceedings, when it's going to be tabled, and people are invited, organizations are invited, and they're able to also put in their questions when the minister is presenting the table, the draft budget for discussion. So the space is slowly opening, but we take it as it comes. In more cautious, but more positively.
Thank you very much, Achan, for your reflection. I'm moving on to Anton. Anton, could you provide insights into how the TU Lab managed to sustain its influence beyond the release of the report, particularly facilitating the interaction and collaboration within the broader interdisciplinary community of urbanists? To collaborate perhaps with the role that external actors had in utilizing TU Lab's work for policy review and research.
Sure, yeah, I think, thanks, Marcella. I mean, one of the things that we paid a lot of attention to when we established the TU Lab is what was it? People came into that space thinking this is a workshop or it's a policy formulation space. We try to make it what sometimes referred to as a third space, but something slightly different, right? We began every TU Lab sitting with a piece of performing art, just to remind people that they were here to think, to be creative, that this wasn't just a case of pitching up and going through the motions, but we were really looking for a fresh tranche of ideas and a fresh way of thinking about urbanization in Tanzania. And so I think that was a challenge at the process. And of course, once we created that space and created this deliberative environment, which didn't come naturally to lots of the participants, once we had created it, we had to work quite hard, which each sitting, to actually defend that space, to keep that culture alive and to try and enrich it. But what it meant, we had the benefit of 3 years of doing this. What it meant at the end of, I think in the end it was 12 or maybe even 14 sittings of the TU Lab, we had a community of friends. We didn't all agree with each other. We often represented quite divergent interests, but we knew each other quite well. And I think, I don't want to over-imagine this, but I think there was a degree of trust which built over time. And what that provided was not only a very useful community and a useful kind of platform for building out the national urban policy, which was my responsibility in that particular context, but it actually proved very useful to a range of different, particularly donor interests. I know that UNICEF came in after us and said, well, what about cities and the safety of children? And they used the TU Lab subsequently, because we suddenly had this platform of making ideas legible to local policymakers, making them visible, but also to do that thing which very often isn't done, which is the local interpretation of big international efforts and ideas into a local context. And so the stitching together of something which gets donor support or big budget support at an international level, but was historically proven quite difficult to actually give meaning to at the local level, to really make work at the local level where the context might be different. And I think the 2 Lab has shown that once we had that sort of culture and that community in place, actually they were useful to a range of different policy interests for a range of different reasons as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anton and everyone. I am so sorry we have so little time, because I know that we could keep asking you questions and there's so much more that you could unpack here. I think we're almost out of time, Jane, with the recording. So as next steps, let me just check this because we are beyond the hour. Okay, yeah, so Jane is coming back in a minute. So Anton, I have one question for you to follow up on your research. So I was wondering, how can South Africa's experience with these evolving epistemic communities provide insights for other countries aiming to enhance evidence integration into policymaking processes, especially in contexts where similar shifts between academic, political, and activist communities are occurring?
So there are 2 things which I think are very important, and why the South African experience helps speak to the global experience. One is that I think it gives us a measure. We can begin to understand when there's a genuine policy process as opposed to one that is not really genuine. And also, secondly, understanding the conditions in which those which genuine policy proposals can be implemented. So the first one is to understand that a genuine policy process begins to happen when the community is grounding their proposals in genuine analysis of causal variables in the local circumstances, whatever it might be, whether it's in public service reform, whether it's in the environmental sphere, policing, whatever it is. So, for example, if the community is merely borrowing good practice from elsewhere and deems that is sufficient, I think that is not a genuine policy process. So I think the concept of an epistemic community allows us to begin to distinguish between what I'm calling a genuine policy process as opposed to one that is merely mimetic, one that is merely copying experiences from elsewhere. And I think that copying experience is one that takes us down a dead end. I mean, the work done by Pritchett and Wilcock and others, for example, around isomorphic mimicry, for example, suggesting that Willbank practices over a very long period of time have produced very little, have produced very, very few positive outputs, precisely because there's just so much of this there's so much of this copying. So I think it allows us to distinguish between a good policy process and one that is not so good. The second one is thinking around the conditions under which policy is likely to be implemented. And I think there one has to think around epistemological communities in relationship to the political environment. So I think one has to be realistic here in the policy space. There are some times that even when one is successful in creating a community that produces high quality analysis and high quality proposals, there are political circumstances when those proposals will not be implemented, no matter how well they are thought through and the quality of that analysis. So I think it's understanding the policy process in relationship to the broader political process that is absolutely fundamental, to understand when it is more or less likely that those policies will be implemented and how to take them up. So I'm actually encouraged in the South African circumstances, and I think it's that those same learnings apply in the international space as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ivor, for your input this time around.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be part of this project and this group. Thank you.